Do you see so many people nowadays talking about trauma and ADHD and wonder, is there an interconnection with that? Now, this is a super sensitive podcast episode today, and if you wonder if you have ADHD, maybe you're wondering if you've experienced trauma or both, then this podcast episode is definitely for you. Hi everybody, my name is Caroline Strawson. A massive welcome to my podcast, Trauma and Narcissism Redefined, where we really look to have those conversations, the curiosities, and I'm no medical doctor as such. Yes, I'm trained in lots of different trauma therapies and coaching, but I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm posing these questions. And of course, anything that I talk about in any of my podcasts, always go and seek out your own medical health professional for their advice. But in today's episode, I want to talk to you really about something that I think needs to be talked about, really, and it's a really, really sensitive topic. So I first want to frame this podcast with the fact that I am such an advocate for each and every one of us to be an advocate for our own brain, health, mind, body, because you know what? No one has walked your shoes, and I am not here to sit in judgment on anybody, and what you feel is real, it's true, and I totally respect that. What I'm here in this podcast to do is to maybe get you to be a bit curious, to maybe start to look at reasons, root causes, what's happening in your body and what you can do about all of that as well, even if it's something that you've been born with. And I think this is one of the key things that we forget. And this is why this topic is a sensitive subject, because, if you're suffering with and been diagnosed with ADHD, and even the word suffer doesn't seem right, does it? Because it can be a real superpower for many people too, that we start to have these discussions and it just escalates. And my hope from this podcast is not to have an escalation like that, but for you all to know that this is coming from a place of compassion, of kindness and curiosity, to spark these questions and debates so you can be the best advocate for your life, regardless of what that looks like. And I think that is a really, really important part of really what I'm trying to get across in this podcast too, because no one has walked your shoes. So I've had so many discussions recently now with regards ADHD and trauma, and maybe the crossovers that might be there. Now, I am not sharing this podcast to say ADHD doesn't exist, it is all trauma related. That is not what I am saying at all, because we know, and again, there's a great guy actually, I've listened to him on Stephen Bartlett's podcast and also over on Instagram, Dr. Arman, where he has brain scans and looks at ADHD brains and things like this. It is a different brain. And I'm not here to say otherwise. So this isn't a podcast to say you don't have ADHD and it is only trauma. So I want to preface that to start off with, okay? But I do want you to start to look at and be advocates for your own health in all of this. I want you to start to get curious about and really look at everything, because ultimately this helps you live your own best life as well. Now, one of the key missing pieces, I feel, which is in the diagnosis of ADHD, is that we don't actually look at the person's trauma history. We're only looking at the symptoms or the behavior. And it's a real missing piece, whether that's a child or as an adult. We have to be looking also at the trauma history of that individual, because trauma can mimic pretty much all of the symptoms of ADHD as well. So this is really us saying, is it ADHD only? Is it actually only trauma? Is it both? And coming from a medical background myself and being a scientist too, my curiosity is, do you get a different diagnosis depending on who you go and see? If you went to see a psychiatrist that specialized in ADHD, would you get an ADHD diagnosis? If you went to see a psychiatrist that specialized in trauma, would you get a complex PTSD or even borderline personality disorder diagnosis? So this is my curiosity about all of this, and this is why I'm sharing it with an open heart, so that you start to question as well. If you have a diagnosis of ADHD, who gave you the diagnosis, and do they have anything to gain from that? And that's just me kind of saying this. There may be nothing, by the way, but I want you to get curious, because this is you and your health that we are talking about and living your life as well. So I'm going to run through some of the symptoms that are there for both trauma and ADHD. Now, if they are the same, surely then that means that depending on who you maybe go and see to get a diagnosis will be dependent on what they then say for you. And again, this is something that I want you to start to think about. So here's some that are crossovers: disorganizations and problems prioritizing, poor time management skills, problems focusing on a task, trouble multitasking, excessive activity or restlessness, poor planning, low frustration tolerance, frequent mood swings, problems following through and completing tasks, hot temper, rage, trouble coping with stress. Now, you may hear those and think, yeah, I can relate to those. And I will have listeners going, yes, that's the trauma I've had. And I will have listeners that say, yes, because I have ADHD. Now, none of you are wrong. None of you are wrong. But can you see the crossovers that start to happen? Now, I know I do not have ADHD, but I do know that I pretty much experienced all of the symptoms and traits that I have just gone through as well. And I absolutely know that I was suffering myself with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, all of the above. But I didn't get a diagnosis of ADHD, and I know I don't have ADHD because I have looked at the potential of, do I have that? And I don't. But I do know I've experienced trauma. And I've worked with many clients who are neurodivergent who do have a diagnosis of ADHD. And I never ever take that away, ever, when I work with my clients at all. But what I do, which I think is a massive, massive missing piece, is I also work on my ADHD clients around trauma, because every single one of us has experienced some kind of trauma. Everyone. Trauma doesn't just have to be these big events, these big things. And in fact, trauma isn't those things anyway. Trauma, actually, beautifully eloquently put by Dr. Gabor Mate, trauma is actually what happens inside of us as a result of what happens outside of us. And it's very often around the negative cognition, the burden, the beliefs that we have about ourselves. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless, I'm helpless, I don't matter, I'm unlovable. And that really becomes our trauma, and our inner system is driven to move us away from that core emotional pain that we might be feeling too. So when I work with my clients with ADHD, with a diagnosis, I'm also working and looking at their trauma history as well. That does not take away the fact that their diagnosis of ADHD. And I think this is the missing piece that often when we talk about ADHD, we don't talk about either. Because ultimately, yes, ADHD can be a superpower, and it really, really can for many, many people. But ultimately, sometimes it can stop people maybe reaching their potential in some things and cause issues within their life too. And that can bring up a lot of shame and almost a secondary trauma because of the diagnosis of ADHD as well. Because some people love it and see it as a superpower, but some people don't. They see it, as something that is bad and it's stopping them living their life. And that in itself can lead to more trauma. So this is where we have to look holistically at an individual, at all parts of them. This is why I love using IFS when I work with my clients at internal family systems, evidence-based parts therapy. And actually, I know Dick Schwartz, who founded internal family systems, has said when he did a lot of parts work, a lot of his symptoms of ADHD started to dissipate and decline. So when we're working with parts and we look at ADHD even as a part of us, it's not that we want to get rid of that part. We never want to get rid of parts of us because they're there for a reason. We work with the part so that it can stabilize within our system so we can lead our best life. But if we're not also looking at the trauma history that we've had to have completion of these survival responses that have remained stuck in our nervous system, the trauma can really exacerbate ADHD symptoms, which can then lead to secondary trauma on top of all of that as well. So we need to have an understanding of all of those things too. And it doesn't mean someone doesn't have ADHD, but every one of us, every single one of us will have trauma. So we want to be working with that too. So my curiosity always is when I'm working with clients is, how much of these presenting symptoms that they've come to work with me are trauma related and how much are ADHD related? And how much together are they exacerbating each other? You know, because if someone has ADHD, well, we can't change that. There's the diagnosis, right? But what we can do on the trauma side is process and integrate and reorganize past trauma to make the ADHD potentially more manageable for that individual too. And again, I work with parts and ADHD, and you know, I see a lot of my clients sometimes holding a lot of shame around their ADHD diagnosis because they feel judged by others. And again, one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is, you know, we should not be judging others. If you are judging someone else, that is a part of you. You're not coming from a place of self-energy and self-leadership with kindness and compassion and curiosity. Okay, judgment is a protector part, and it says more about you if you judge others than the person you are actually judging. It's really important for us to know that. So when I work with somebody, I want to help. If there's any shame there, you know, we want to lift all of that to support someone to lead their best life, regardless of what age that they are, either from things that have happened in the past and to also navigating ADHD, because there are no bad parts of us, none. And this work, when I do parts work and somatic work with my ADHD clients, it really, really is transformational for them because there's no bad parts. ADHD is not a bad part of an individual. We're just going to work together within that client's individual system. But if there is a trauma history and maybe there's some other parts showing up, we're going to work with them to see if their strong destructive role that they've taken on within the system can calm. And then the ADHD becomes potentially more manageable so that you're able to do more things in your life as well. And one of the sad things that I see as well, so much, especially with children, is many kids nowadays are getting an ADHD diagnosis. Now, is this because we know more about it? And yes, the answer could be that, absolutely. But what I'm seeing a lot of is a lot of these children that we're giving an ADHD diagnosis with, we're not also looking at the trauma history. Now, yes, it could just be ADHD, but equally, they may need some support because there's some trauma history there. And this isn't about shaming any parents who have children with ADHD diagnosis. Absolutely not. Because again, research does suggest that there could be some genetic link to this too. Again, I am not an expert in the research and everything else. I'm putting it out there with curiosity and kindness so that you can be curious as well. So this isn't saying that any parent who has a child with ADHD, then there's trauma and you're a bad parent. Remember, as a kid, it's all about perception and how we perceive certain situations as well. But again, that can exacerbate symptoms of ADHD because very often when all of us and when children have experienced trauma, and remember, trauma is perception for an individual from an emotional perspective, our middle ear becomes very loose. And what happens is as the sound waves come into our ear, we have a nice tight eardrum and it will send messages into our brain that the sounds are safe and we're okay. And it will drown out the background noise and it will tune in to human voice. Now, when we've experienced trauma, our middle ear becomes much looser. So as the sound waves come in, they go immediately down to our gut, like our gut instinct, and we perceive them to be dangerous. And we actually switch it out. So the background noise, we've turned the volume up because we're scanning for cues of danger. We're more hypervigilant. So we want to tune into the background noise in case something dangerous is coming, and we tune out to the voices. So actually, it's like, if you think of a child in a classroom, if they've experienced some kind of trauma and they seem really, really restless, you imagine turning the volume up on all that background noise in a classroom, that's going to cause anyone to feel a little bit dysregulated as well. So unless we know these things and know what to look for, and it doesn't mean it's not ADHD, it doesn't mean it's not trauma. The likelihood often it is going to be both, but we have to work with both because if we can work on the trauma piece, we can make the symptoms of ADHD far more manageable. And that doesn't mean it needs to disappear. Maybe we have the good parts of the ADHD that can really step in, but maybe those parts from an ADHD perspective that are maybe causing a child or an adult any shame or stopping them achieving something in their life, maybe we can work with those because maybe there's some element of trauma that is unprocessed and we can work with that too. So when we start to have a curiosity, a trauma-informed lens around ADHD, we can start to ask some questions around all of this too. So remember, that's not to say you don't have ADHD. likelihood you will also have trauma. But what are you working on? Is it just the ADHD, or are you looking at those things? It's a tough world out there at the moment. It really, really is. So really the reason why I'm sharing this podcast is with love, with absolute love. And it's to spark conversation and curiosity about this so you can lead your best life. Because you can just have ADHD, you can just have trauma. Likely, if you've got ADHD, you're going to have trauma as well. Now, we can't change the ADHD, but what we can do is absolutely work on that trauma to make the ADHD diagnosis more manageable. Now, I was really unsure about whether to do this podcast because I know it is such a super sensitive subject, and I really, really hope it's been received with the intention that I have given to this podcast, with love, with compassion, with kindness, with curiosity, so that if you do have an ADHD diagnosis, please also think what trauma history is there as well. Equally, if you've got trauma, also particularly in late diagnosed ADHD, I see so many, particularly women, later on in life getting a diagnosis of ADHD, and it makes so much sense. But equally, don't forget the trauma aspect in all of that too, because maybe if you work on the trauma piece, which is what I work with my clients with, whether they're neurodivergent or not, it makes such a big difference to the nervous system regulation and how we can show up and handle challenges in our everyday life. It's tough out there at the moment. It's a hard place. But again, if we're always working on our nervous system and increasing that capacity for us to be able to cope, then it can really help lessen, some of those maybe extreme parts of the ADHD diagnosis as well. So I hope this has been received in the way that I've wanted to share it with, because, in my communities and groups, I see many, many people with an ADHD diagnosis. We talk a lot around narcissism, trauma. We have a lot of these conversations, and I really think it's important to understand where we need to, of course, manage symptoms, but we also need to look at the root cause of the potential trauma that was there. So maybe it becomes less intense with actions associated with all of that. We should be having these conversations. We absolutely should, about the connection with trauma and ADHD, but without taking away anything or judging anybody. It's about kind conversations. ADHD is real. Trauma is real, and trauma can worsen the symptoms of ADHD, and also you can have secondary trauma on top of that because of how people treat you about your ADHD diagnosis. So let's all be kind and respectful on this sensitive subject. I'd love to continue the conversation. Feel free to drop me a message on Instagram. Is this maybe you think about things maybe a bit differently? I don't know about the genetics, the trauma piece, and I'm sparking conversation about this with what I see in my clients. Do we have more diagnosis now because we have more trauma, or just that we know about it? I'm genuinely curious about all of this, because ultimately we should be advocates for our own health. We should be asking these questions so that we can all go on to lead an even better life, because you know what? We deserve it. We really do. And it's so tough out there as it is, let alone with all of this too. So take care, my friends. I hope this has opened a conversation. Maybe you can, share this with your friends. Maybe you can have these conversations, but let me know what you think. And again, you may not agree with anything that I've said, and that is absolutely fine. But let's all still be respectful with each other. There is no judgment here whatsoever. I am always just curious with compassion, and I hope that it gets you thinking about your life, where you are going, what you are achieving or not, and what you can do about it. Because remember, all healing is self-healing. Our own happiness and growth is our responsibility. No one's coming to rescue you, sadly. If you listened to my podcast the other week about the knight in shining armor, you will know that. So take care, my friends, and I will see you on the next episode on Trauma and Narcissism Redefined.